Storms that caused widespread flooding across Indiana over the weekend pushed through the Ohio Valley and out across the East Coast as this week got underway. And that turned out to be only the opening act of what's shaping up to be a genuinely dangerous stretch of weather. An active, multi-day severe weather pattern is now locking into place across a huge stretch of the country, and it's going to bring more severe thunderstorms, more flash flooding, and a genuinely dangerous heat dome all at the same time. Today alone, severe thunderstorms are tracking from the northern and central plains down into the Carolinas, with large hail, damaging winds, and isolated tornadoes on the table, layered on top of a serious flash flooding threat already unfolding across the Appalachians. Tomorrow, that threat expands hard into the Midwest, with powerful supercells expected to fire during the afternoon and evening. And running underneath all of it, a dangerous heat dome is building across the southern plains and southwest that's going to push temperatures into genuinely hazardous territory by the weekend. This week is shaping up to be genuinely one of the most active stretches we've seen so far this month. So let's get straight into the forecast, because there's a lot of ground to cover and the timing details matter enormously here. Let's start with today. We've got elevated severe weather risk zones set up in two separate places. The first runs from Minnesota back into central Nebraska, where the Storm Prediction Center has posted a slight risk. The second sits over near the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. It's worth understanding why the Appalachian piece of this matters so much right now specifically. There's already been dangerous flooding across West Virginia and southern Ohio over the past 24 hours, and unfortunately, a lot more rain is on the way there today on top of a fresh round of severe storms possible throughout the daytime. But the more elevated risk today is really over the central and northern plains. Damaging wind gusts anywhere from 60 to 75 miles per hour are possible there, along with a real risk of large hail, especially from central Nebraska back up towards Sioux Falls. Steep lapse rates are in place today, meaning temperatures dropping rapidly with height as you go up through the atmosphere, and that's exactly the kind of setup that helps produce hailstorms through the afternoon and evening. If any individual storm manages to tap into the low-level jet, which strengthens through the afternoon and evening hours, if you're anywhere in that zone, it's worth staying weather-aware through the day. Tuesday, though, is where I think this pattern really turns into something significant. A deepening area of low pressure is set to move over the Rockies, and a warm sector, essentially a pocket of unusually warm air, will be expanding out ahead of it, with a warm frontal boundary setting up that should help enhance wind shear across the region. The main concern in that zone is damaging wind, and honestly, this could end up being significant. 80-mile-per-hour wind gusts are genuinely on the table for Tuesday afternoon and evening. Large hail is possible too, and depending on exactly how these storms evolve, an upgrade to a higher risk category is entirely plausible. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see an enhanced risk added in a future Outlook update. There's also a tornado risk mainly focused on Omaha, Lincoln, Manhattan, Kansas City, and St. Joseph, and that area could expand further as we get closer to the event, and confidence grows around exactly where a tornado corridor might set up. Now let's walk through the actual timing, starting with what's happening today along the East Coast. Storms should fire up across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia sometime between roughly 3 and 5 p.m. Eastern Time. These are pretty typical pulse thunderstorms for this time of year, but if any segments manage to organize into more of a line, a damaging wind threat becomes possible near Pikeville and Knoxville specifically. Then, by 6 to 7 p.m., an elongated line of showers and thunderstorms should stretch from Roanoke all the way down into Chattanooga, with straight-line winds around 60 to 65 miles per hour, isolated large hail, and a very brief tornado risk possible along that line. Outside of that specific corridor, expect mostly just a lot of storms and a lot of lightning today. If you've got outdoor plans, make sure you've got a reliable way to receive weather alerts, and ideally, something that can flag lightning specifically if you're going to be somewhere like an outdoor sporting event. Back over in the Great Plains, showers and thunderstorms should get going as early as 3 to 4 p.m. in Minnesota, with isolated hail and wind possible there too, though the main corridor we're watching remains further west. That low-pressure system trying to move over the Rockies won't fully arrive until late tonight, but there's at least a non-zero chance of all severe hazards showing up somewhere in that zone before then. Instability today is genuinely impressive, with values pushing upward of 4,000 joules per kilogram just west of Sioux Falls. Plenty of fuel for storms to work with this afternoon. If tornadoes do develop, I don't think Rapid City or Gordon are the most likely spots. Instead, watch further east, where significant tornado parameter values are higher, essentially where the wind shear lines up more favorably. Storms that fire up near Rapid City this afternoon are more likely to produce large hail and maybe some downburst-driven damaging winds rather than tornadoes specifically. But if storms get going near Sioux Falls this evening, that's the area to watch closely for an isolated tornado threat. Storm activity should generally start weakening as we head into the late evening and overnight hours, Current model guidance shows storms ongoing during the early to mid-afternoon hours on Tuesday, mostly producing isolated, damaging wind gusts at that point. But right around 6 to 7 p.m., storms should start firing more widely, and that window is going to be the main one to watch for very large hail, damaging winds, and a couple of tornadoes. Up near Minneapolis and Appleton, expect mostly elevated hail activity with maybe a very low tornado risk in southern Minnesota, depending on exactly how those storms evolve. After sunset, this activity likely consolidates into more of an organized line as it pushes toward Kansas City and Columbia, bringing a significant wind threat with it. Overnight, there's a real flash flood risk near Topeka and Kansas City if storms fire the way current guidance suggests. By Wednesday morning, that line should weaken as it moves into the Ozarks. And Wednesday isn't a clean break either. We'll be watching for additional storms to fire up over the Ohio Valley, with isolated hail and wind, and a brief tornado risk on the table there as well. The peak window for that activity should run roughly from 3 to 8 p.m. If you're anywhere near Detroit, Fort Wayne, Cleveland, or back toward Scranton, stay alert for damaging wind gusts and isolated hail during that window. There's a very low tornado risk just south of Lake Erie, and Akron and Cleveland specifically look like the bullseye for any brief tornado that does develop. Storm activity should weaken again as we move into the overnight hours. Meanwhile, the Central Plains gets another round of severe storms on Wednesday too, though nothing particularly unusual for the middle of August. Typical Great Plains thunderstorms with hail, wind, and plenty of lightning as the main hazards. On top of all that severe weather, flash flooding is a real elevated concern this week, particularly Tuesday and Wednesday. Today, West Virginia, Ohio, and Western Virginia carry a slight risk of excessive rainfall, and a lot of flash flood warnings were already in effect overnight because of how much rain has already fallen there. Tomorrow, that flood risk shifts over toward the Midwest and Central Plains. If you're in Des Moines, Davenport, Quincy, Maryville, or Omaha, watch for flooded roadways becoming more common through the late afternoon and evening. It's genuinely too early to pin down exact rainfall totals for Iowa and Nebraska specifically, since we still don't know precisely how tomorrow's storms will evolve, but current National Weather Service model blends suggest somewhere around 1 to 2 inches near Des Moines, with some isolated spots potentially seeing well more than that. A few locations could realistically approach 4 or 5 inches, which would absolutely be enough to produce flooded roadways in low-lying areas. Back over in the Appalachians, expect roughly a ½ inch to 1.5 inches of additional rainfall on top of what's already fallen, and given the terrain there, that's more than enough for flooding to continue. If you're near I-79 or I-81 today, especially through the afternoon and evening, please stay on high alert. Let's zoom out now and talk about the longer-term pattern across the country, because this week is genuinely eventful beyond just the next 48 hours. Heading into Wednesday and Thursday, the storm system driving all this severe weather across the Central Plains and Ohio Valley will start to weaken and shift eastward. There's still some severe weather potential on Wednesday, mainly focused on the Ohio Valley again, with maybe another round over Nebraska and Kansas. By Thursday and Friday, I'm not expecting any organized severe threats, but by the weekend and into early next week, keep an eye on the Great Lakes, where a weak area of low pressure passing through could bring at least some renewed severe weather potential. Overall, though, the middle and end of this week should be comparatively spotty for severe storms after these first few very active days. Now, on the tropics, because we haven't talked much about that side of things over the last day or two, Hurricane Lala nearly made landfall on the Big Island of Hawaii just a couple of days ago and brought genuinely catastrophic flooding there. Over in the Atlantic, wind shear is currently running so high that there's essentially nothing organizing right now, which is honestly a relief to see. That said, I'm still watching the Atlantic basin closely because I do think we'll get at least 1 or 2 more tropical waves moving through before the end of the month. Whether any of those actually develop into something organized is a different question, and right now I'd put the odds on the lower side, with the odds of any direct U.S. impact even lower still, mainly because of how much dry air and wind shear is currently in place across the basin. But it only takes one. If a tropical storm or hurricane does manage to develop anywhere near the Gulf, given how warm the water temperatures are running and how relatively untapped that environment is right now, it could intensify explosively in a short window. For the moment, dry air and wind shear are the 2 things keeping that scenario from playing out, but that's worth watching rather than dismissing entirely. Now let's talk about the heat, because this is going to be genuinely brutal over the next 7 days, especially if you're in Texas, Arkansas, or Mississippi. It's essentially going to be the same day repeating over and over in the Dallas area, with temperatures forecast to reach the mid to upper 100s. We're talking about a high of 106 in Dallas today. That heat is going to build further north as we move into tomorrow. If you're in Kansas or southwest Missouri near Springfield, you're going to want sunscreen if you're heading outside, and dressing light is genuinely the move because it's going to feel like baking. By Wednesday and Thursday, that heat should retreat back toward Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma as the same cold frontal boundary driving Tuesday and early Wednesday's severe weather pushes south. But don't get comfortable, because by the weekend, if that heat dome builds right back in, Dallas could approach 110 degrees by around Saturday. So brace for another round of genuinely dangerous heat there. If you're in the Midwest or Great Lakes instead, the picture is a lot more pleasant for this time of year. You could actually see overnight lows dropping into the 50s and 40s by the weekend, and parts of northern Wisconsin could see lows as cold as 42 or 43 degrees, driven by a large area of low pressure sitting over Canada. It's worth taking a moment to explain why this particular pattern is producing such a wide, simultaneous mix of hazards, severe storms, flash flooding, and dangerous heat all at once across such a large stretch of the country, because it's not actually three unrelated stories. The same broad atmospheric setup driving all of it involves a deep trough digging into the western and central U.S., which is what's pulling that Rockies area low-pressure system eastward and generating the wind shear needed for organized rotating supercells, rather than just ordinary pulse thunderstorms. At the same time, a building ridge of high pressure over the southern plains and southwest is doing exactly what ridges of high pressure do in summer, sinking air, suppressing cloud cover, and allowing temperatures to climb largely unchecked underneath it, which is precisely the mechanism behind a heat dome. Where that ridge and that trough meet and interact along their shared boundary is exactly where you get the sharpest contrast in temperature and moisture. And that contrast is what's fueling the flash flooding risk across the Appalachians and Ohio Valley specifically, since repeated rounds of thunderstorms training over the same saturated ground is a direct consequence of that boundary staying relatively stationary for several days running rather than pushing cleanly through. Understanding that connection is useful context for the rest of the summer too, since this same basic pattern, a persistent western trough paired with a stubborn eastern or southern ridge, tends to repeat itself multiple times across any given severe weather season. And recognizing the setup early is part of how meteorologists start flagging multi-day, multi-hazard stretches like this one several days out rather than day by day. It's also worth putting this week's severe weather in the context of the broader 2026 season overall, since it helps explain why forecasters have been sounding a consistent note of caution all summer. Long-range outlooks issued earlier this year projected somewhere between 1,050 and 1,250 tornadoes across the U.S. for 2026, and identified a hail risk hotspot running from Texas through Alabama, along with a second hotspot centered almost exactly on the region getting hit hardest this week: Iowa, northern Missouri, eastern Nebraska, and northeastern Kansas. Forecasters have been explicit that even in a year where total tornado reports might trend a bit lower than the year before, flash floods and damaging wind gusts can be every bit as destructive as tornadoes, and often affect a considerably larger geographic area in the process, since a single derecho-style wind event or a slow-moving flash flood can spread damage across dozens of counties in a way an individual tornado track typically doesn't. That's really the core message worth taking away from a week like this one. It only takes one storm hitting a densely populated or otherwise vulnerable community to turn an ordinary severe weather week into something genuinely devastating, regardless of how the broader seasonal statistics end up shaking out by the time autumn arrives. It's also worth explaining briefly why forecasters lean so heavily on instability and shear values, like that 4,000 joules per kilogram figure mentioned for today, rather than just watching radar and waiting to see what shows up. Convective available potential energy, or CAPE, is essentially a measure of how much fuel is sitting in the atmosphere for a thunderstorm updraft to use, and values above roughly 2,500 to 3,000 joules per kilogram are already considered strongly favorable for severe storms. Today's readings, pushing past 4,000 near Sioux Falls, represent genuinely extreme instability for this stage of August. Wind shear, meanwhile, measures how much wind speed and direction change with height, and it's the ingredient that determines whether a storm simply produces heavy rain and some hail versus actually organizing into a rotating supercell capable of producing a tornado. High instability without much shear tends to produce intense but disorganized storms. Heavy rain and hail without much rotation. High shear without much instability often can't sustain strong enough updrafts to matter much at all. It's specifically the combination of both showing up in the same place at the same time, which is exactly what's setting up across the northern plains today and again across the Midwest tomorrow. That turns a forecast from routine summer thunderstorms into a genuine severe weather threat worth tracking closely. Given everything happening this week, it's worth taking a minute on basic severe weather preparedness, since a little planning genuinely does pay off here. Know ahead of time where the safest place in your home, workplace, or your kid's school actually is if a warning is issued. For tornadoes, that generally means the lowest floor, an interior room away from windows. Make sure you have a reliable way to receive warnings even overnight, since a lot of the most dangerous severe weather this week is going to be moving through during evening and overnight hours when people are asleep and less likely to be checking a forecast on their own. If you're in a flood-prone area, never drive through a flooded roadway. It takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle off the road entirely, and a disproportionate share of flood deaths every year happens specifically because someone tried to push through water they underestimated. And if severe weather does move through your area, resist the urge to go outside and look, however tempting that is. Wait until the actual warning has expired for your specific location before assuming it's safe. It's also worth spending a moment on how the Storm Prediction Center's risk categories actually work, since I've been referencing slight, marginal, and enhanced risk throughout this forecast, and it helps to understand what those labels genuinely mean rather than treating them as arbitrary. The SPC uses a 5-tier system running from marginal, the lowest category, up through slight, enhanced, moderate, and finally high, the rarest and most dangerous designation, reserved for setups with a very high probability of significant, widespread, severe weather. A marginal risk generally means isolated severe storms are possible, but not widely expected. A slight risk, which covers a good chunk of what we're watching today and tomorrow, means scattered severe storms are more likely, still not necessarily widespread, but a real, legitimate threat worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Enhanced risk, the next step up, is where forecasters start expecting numerous severe storms across a broader area, and it's genuinely worth noting when a slight risk zone looks like it could get upgraded to enhanced as models come into better agreement, the way I mentioned might happen with Tuesday's outlook. Wednesday, another round hits the Ohio Valley specifically, plus a continuation of typical Great Plains storms further west. And running underneath literally all of it, a dangerous building heat dome across the southern plains and southwest that's going to push Dallas back toward 110 degrees by the weekend, easing briefly midweek before rebuilding. Meanwhile, the Midwest and Great Lakes actually get a genuinely pleasant break on the temperature side, even as they deal with their own share of the severe weather passing through. And out in the Atlantic, Hurricane Lala's damage in Hawaii is still fresh. The basin itself remains quiet for now thanks to dry air and wind shear, but it's worth watching closely as we move through the final stretch of August, since it genuinely only takes one storm finding the right conditions to change that picture quickly. Steep terrain sheds water quickly into narrow valleys and creek systems that simply don't have the capacity to handle a sudden surge, and when the ground is already saturated from the previous 24 hours of rain, as it is right now across West Virginia and southern Ohio, even a modest additional round of storms can push already swollen creeks and rivers over their banks fast, often with only a short warning window between a flash flood warning being issued and water actually reaching dangerous levels. That combination, steep terrain plus already saturated ground plus another round of storms training over roughly the same corridor, is precisely the recipe behind some of the most damaging flash flood events in this region historically, which is part of why this particular piece of the forecast is getting flagged as urgently as the more visually dramatic tornado and hail threats further west. This is an active, complicated week with a lot of moving pieces across a huge stretch of the country, and the forecast details, especially for Tuesday and Wednesday, are still going to sharpen up as we get closer to those events and get fresh model data to work with. Stay weather aware over the next several days, especially if you're anywhere in that Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri corridor, or along the Appalachian flash flood zone, and make sure you've got a reliable way to get warnings the moment they're issued for your specific area, since a meaningful share of this week's most dangerous weather is going to be moving through overnight when it's easiest to miss. We'll keep tracking how this entire pattern evolves and bring you updates as new model data and fresh outlooks come in over the next several days. If you take away one thing from this forecast, let it be this. The most dangerous window across the Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri corridor and the Appalachian flash flood zone alike is very likely going to arrive overnight or in the evening hours, exactly when it's easiest to be caught off guard, asleep, or simply not paying attention to the sky. A forecast this active, spanning severe storms, flash flooding, and dangerous heat simultaneously across such a wide stretch of the country doesn't come together every week, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than treated as routine August weather.